I wanted to ask about extremism in Islam and where it got its start. Is this something that came from the Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia? Is this something that came from Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini, or does it go before that?
Well, the sad reality is that extreme interpretations of Islam and the violence that they breed predate Wahhabism, the Ayatollah Khomeini. For that matter, they even predate the rise of the West. We know, for example, that most of the early successors of the Prophet Muhammad were slaughtered by fellow Muslims. They were assassinated. And this is something that, in fact, is a pattern within Islam. The fact of the matter is that, more Muslims are tortured and raped and maimed, imprisoned and murdered by fellow Muslims than at the hands of any foreign imperial power. And I know that's very difficult for Muslims to hear. It is so much easier to continue, hurling insults and anger at the West. And I'm not going to, deny that such a thing as Western imperialism exists. But I'm going to point out that within Islam, there has been another kind of imperialism that we also need to conquer. And that is tribal imperialism. The imperialism of Arab tribes that have foisted or grafted or imposed their particular cultural customs on, on the faith of Islam. So that if we are going to call ourselves, anti-imperialists as Muslims, we also have to pay attention to the fact that Muslims are killing one another and not just being killed at the hands of the West. And that is why I, emphasize in my book and in all of the work I do that we Muslims have to own up to the extremism that is a very deep strain within Islam. The Quran itself tells us God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. This is chapter 13, verse 11. And I like to think of it as a 1311 solution to a 9/11 kind of problem.
Does Islam condone using children as child soldiers, as human bombs?
To the best of my understanding of the Quran, no. In fact, the Quran contains many progressive verses about children, about respecting especially orphans, about ensuring that even in the course of a defensive war, women and children are not slaughtered. And yet, the very opposite happens under the banner of Islam. And again, I respect and acknowledge that, many Muslims will say, no, 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 Islam has nothing to do with this. These are all crimes of culture. The problem with that argument is that it's true only in theory. In reality, child soldiers and child slaves are used within Islam in the name of God. And that is why it becomes a problem for us Muslims to contend with. We are doing our ummah, our worldwide Muslim nation, absolutely no favors by sweeping these realities under the rug. And there are some things that are happening within the Islamic world that simply cannot be blamed on Israel, on MTV, or on American foreign policy. At a certain point, we Muslims have to take responsibility for our piece of what we are contributing to the crisis in Islam today.
What else can moderate Muslims, reformist Muslims do to help themselves, help one another, get the word out, get involvement?
Well, I'm glad, first of all, that you acknowledge that it's reform-minded Muslims as opposed to just moderate Muslims. And the moment moderate Muslims begin to acknowledge that our religion and the scriptures within our Quran need to be reinterpreted for a 21st century pluralistic context, that is when the real change will begin to happen. So when you say, what else can Muslims do? This is the first thing that we can do. We can, acknowledge that the Quran has some delicious ambiguities to it. That yes, it may be perfect because it comes from God himself, but that Allah's interpreters are not perfect. And that as a result, we have to be vigilant as Muslims, that for every new generation and in different parts of the world, there ought to be different interpretations in order to fit the modernizing, standards of the day. And again, if we say that this is un-Islamic, all we are doing is making the rest of the world believe that we as Muslims and our faith of Islam is not capable of growing. That is simply not true. It is we who have to take the faith out of its time warp. And when we do, we will actually be paying tribute to the majesty of God himself. Because what God would ever be satisfied with creating something so narrow and so rigid as a dogma instead of something that is deeply felt, namely an evolving faith?